Hey guys, here for another chapter of the Skeleton Tree. Chapter 11, The Grizzly Bear. Wah.
Now Frank is on his way. I hear the sound of his boots in the meadow, and I look back to see a mist shimmering around his feet as he kicks through the grass. I'm pleased to see him. He pats the wooden saint on the shoulder, then sits in the chair beside me. North and south he looks, out across the sea. "No one coming yet?" he asks. I shake my head. It's still early. He stretches out his legs and crosses them at the ankles. Then he tilts back to let the sun fall on his face and closes his eyes. I start reading again, but it's hard to concentrate on the story when I expect to see the men arrive at any moment. The baby Catel was still alive when the ravens came. One was Cloud and the other Storm, and they were big, strong birds with beaks like pickaxes. They could have killed the baby easily, but the thought did not occur to them. Ravens are not killers. Feeling nothing but pity for Catel, Storm carried him away to their nest to raise him as their own. Into the lining of feathers and moss she tucked him, to hide him from the vultures. The cabin guy has scribbled right across the page, "Vultures in Greenland." I can almost see him shaking his head. A raven's love is deep and endless. Storm tucked her wings around the baby and cried the sound of happiness. Down upon mother and child, the northern lights burn like a river of melted stars. I love to see the northern lights. They're a shimmer as pale as smoke, a veil of blue and green. Now dim, now bright, they plunge towards earth and rise again. Sometimes they crackle and hiss. The first time Frank and I saw them, we knew they marked a change. Summer fogs had given way to autumn storms, and now winter was beginning. After nearly 40 days in Alaska, our lives had changed. We weren't kept prisoners by the darkness anymore, trapped in our little cabin from sunset till dawn. We had turned sticks and plastic into torches. We carried fire in our hands. Frank came in from the forest, sweeping shadows in front of him as he held his torch. "You can see the northern lights," he said. "They're burning down upon us like a river of melted stars." Our fire had been burning steadily for 3 days, and it smoldered in the stone circle on the floor. A dozen fish hung drying in the curls of smoke. I had to push past Frank in the doorway because he wouldn't move aside. Then I looked up through the trees and saw the aurora shine and flicker. "Let's go out to the point," said Frank. "We'll see it better from there." I chose a torch from our supply in the corner. Its head was a plastic bottle, stuffed with anything that would burn. When I lit it from the fire, it burned with spurting flames and putrid smoke, but nothing could put it out. As we walked through the forest with our torches guttering, we must have looked savage and wild. Around the skeleton tree was a growing heap of plastic junk, a little mountain held down by strips of fishing net. It was Frank's obsession to build it as high as he could, to make a signal fire that could be seen from miles away. From our torches flew fiery spurts that fell into the grass in blobs of flame. We watched the northern lights swirl and stretch, flashing blue and green. As though to add their mystery, wolves began singing in the distance. Their howling songs seemed to match the changes of the northern lights, as though they sang to the aurora. Frank said softly, "Makes you feel kind of small, doesn't it?" "Yes," I said. "Insignificant." He chose the biggest word he'd ever used to say how puny we were in that enormous world. In a way he was right, but in a way he was wrong. We had beaten the darkness, holding back with our torches the wild animals, the ghosts and skeletons. We were the most powerful things in our little part of the planet, but in the larger world, we were also nothing. "If I die, no one will care," said Frank. "What about your mom?" I asked. "What about your friends?" "They won't know," he said. "If they don't know, how can they care?" The torches made his face grim and ghastly. "Nothing will change. The sun will keep going around, and the tide will rise and fall, and down in the city it will be just another day." He didn't sound afraid. He didn't even sound angry. I wasn't sure what he was trying to tell me. "We're just a bunch of atoms," he said. "If I die, my atoms get scattered around and that's the end. Maybe the northern lights are the atoms of dead people." "But you're not going to die," I said. "Chris, it's getting worse." He held out the black glove, as though he could see his hand inside of it. "I don't know why we try so hard to stay alive," he said. "What difference does it make?" I wanted to tell him that it made a huge difference, but I couldn't think of why that was. Disappointed, Frank threw his torch out over the water. It flew in a flaming arc across the northern lights like a comet trailing fire and vanished in the blackness of the ocean. Our world shrank. With only my torch to keep it away, the darkness crept closer. When the flames started sputtering, we fled for the cabin. It was another cold night, another wintry morning. When I saw frost on the ground, I knew Frank had been right all along. Winter would be long and hard, and we needed more fish. But he didn't want to go to the river that morning. "I've got things to do," he told me. "Like what?" He only shrugged, but it wasn't hard to guess. As soon as I was out of sight, I thought he would start building his catapult or Bengali man-trap. Frank had a grizzly to kill. So I went alone to the river. Not even Thursday was with me. He was never around when wolves were nearby. I didn't feel afraid as I came near to the river. I was wary, like a deer, but I wasn't afraid. For ages I crouched beside the pool, but the only fish that floated past were either dying or dead. I remember how the water had churned with masses of salmon, and it was hard to believe that they had vanished so quickly. I climbed the rocks at the side of the falls and walked upstream, watching for the bear. I told myself it had a huge territory and was probably nowhere near me. Rising above the forest, the blue slopes of the mountain were speckled with fresh snow, but the river had shrunk again, and dead fish lay draped over stones, snarled among bushes and logs. I saw fish with no tails, and tails with no fish, and shapeless blobs that squirmed with maggots. The smell was strong and terrible. Massive flocks of gulls pecked away in a frenzy. I saw 4 or 5 ravens, and was pretty sure that Thursday was among them, but he didn't come to greet me. He was too busy picking brains from the skulls of dead salmons. I walked right up the middle of the river. In the shallow places I saw the last fish still struggling. Their whole backs out of the water, I gaffed them and hauled them out, clubbed them on the banks of the river, and on I went. With a gaff in my hands, the birds scattering in front of me, I felt hugely powerful. I was the king of the river. Eagles soared away as I came near them. Little animals scurried off into the bushes, and the masses of gulls split apart screaming. Every creature on the river made room for my passing, and I bullied my way through them all. Carrying 8 fish on my back, I rounded a bend in the river, and there was the grizzly bear. It was only 15 yards away, wading towards me down the deepest part of the stream. Its head was lowered, its tongue hanging loosely, water dripping from its snout and the fur on its belly. Its hump shifted as it swayed along. Between the bear and me, all the birds on the river suddenly arose in a mass and flew away. They went with the sound of a breaking wave, with the rustle of feathers and wings. The bear was headed straight towards me. If it didn't look up, it would blunder right into me. But if it did look up, it would see me blocking its path, and what would happen then? Through my mind whirled things I had read and things I had been told. Never run from a bear. Stand your ground. Play dead. Fight back. Then the bear lifted its head, and our eyes met. Its muzzle thrust forward. Its eyes squinted. Slowly it rose to its hind legs, just as it had on the first day I'd seen it. "He can't see very well," Frank had said then. "Don't move," he told me. The bear opened its mouth and roared. I saw its teeth, its dark gums, the black tunnel of its throat. "Make yourself look small, make yourself look big, scream and shout, wave your arms, back away slowly." I had heard every imaginable bit of advice, but still had no idea what to do. The bear fell again to its 4 feet, splashing into the river. I thought of the fish that I carried on my back, that wet and slimy cluster of salmon. They reeked of blood and rotten flesh. To the bear I must have smelt delicious. It stepped forward. I stepped back. For a moment, again, we stared at each other. As the bear swung its head, the hairs bristled on its back like porcupine needles. With a bellowing roar, it started running towards me. It came faster than I would have believed was possible. It galloped through the water, its muscles heaving, its feet churning foam from the river. Before I could even raise my arms to protect myself, it was right in front of me. And then, just inches away, it planted its front feet in the riverbed and slid to a stop. Gravel piled up in front of its paws and the river flowed gray from the silt and the dirt it had kicked up. I was still holding the gaff. I was still holding the fish. Our eyes were almost level, and all I could do was stare right back at the bear. I was too petrified to look away. I smelled its breath, hot and fishy. I trembled as it gnashed its teeth, a sound like stones being knocked together. I trembled until I thought I might fall to pieces. If the bear was going to kill me, there was nothing I could do. I couldn't outrun it. I couldn't fight it. I felt like screaming, but I couldn't even do that. I let my eyes close, I let my head sag, and my hand fall to my side. I felt the rope unwind from my fist and the salmon slide down my back to the river. I whispered, "Please don't kill me." The bear roared. It snapped its teeth again with that terrible sound. The gaff flew out of my hands as I tripped on the stones. I thumped flat in the shallows, shocked for a moment by the coldness of the water. Sprawled on my back, I tried to squirm away across the gravel, over the rotted corpses of the fish. I had become one of them, desperate thing, trying to swim where there wasn't any water. Step by step, the bear came closer. It sniffed at my foot, at my leg, at my stomach. I could see its nostrils twitching. I could hear its breath going in and out. I lay as still as I could as the river flowed around me. The bear straddled my legs with its paws. It sniffed at my chest. It sniffed at my shoulder. I thought I had never seen anything so big and so frightening. The bear was enormous, its legs like stumps. I saw the long, thick hairs in its chest, the short bristles on its muzzle, the black curl of its lips. I closed my eyes and its nose touched my chin. The lips brushed my neck. I breathed in air that I breathed out. As it sniffed and sniffed, I began to cry. I sobbed. The fur on its chin rubbed across my cheek. Its hot breath whooshed over my eyes. "Please don't," I said again. Maybe it understood, maybe not. If it thought like Frank, it was merely satisfied. It had made it very clear who owned the river, whose territory we were in. It had stood its ground and now could leave. With one more roar, it raised its head and backed away. When I dared to open my eyes, it was already plodding up the river. But I didn't move, even after it passed out of sight again, not for a long time later. I just lay in the icy water, looking up at the sky and treetops, at the mountain with snow on its peak. Then I collected my gaff, and I gathered my fish, and I trudged downstream. Down to the falls, then down to the pool, then along the beach. I couldn't stop shivering. I felt the touch of the bear's lips and fur. I smelt its breath. I thought these things would never leave me, as though I had been branded. When a shadow flickered across the beach, I looked high. Above my head a raven circled, 1,000 feet in the air. It was just a small black shape, but I was sure it was Thursday, keeping watch over me. Half a mile from the wreck of the Reepicheep, I could still feel the touch of the bear on my skin. I still felt every bit as frightened as I had then. 100 times I'd looked back to make sure it wasn't following me. 100 times I'd only seen the empty beach, with the waves folding up along the shore in their steady rows. And now I looked again, and there was the bear. Over the stones, over the logs, it came steadily along my trail. I went faster, but so did the bear. I dropped my fish, hoping that it would satisfy it, and doubled my pace. All I wanted to do was get away from it. I could not stand the thought of seeing it coming at me again. But the bear was less than a quarter mile behind me when he passed the fish, without stopping. By then I could see the wreck. The cliffs behind it soared up the forest like walls of a castle. With no hope of climbing them, no chance of reaching the cabin, I headed for the wreck instead. For the last few yards I ran as fast as I could, slipping in my stupid castaway shoes. In a glance back, I saw the bear running too. loping along the beach. I crawled underneath the reebage heap and up through the hole that had been punched in the hull into the fish hold of that poor little boat. It was high enough that I could stand up straight, below the thick beams that held the deck. Right above me was the hatch, with a huge log lying across it. Light came through there and through the cracks between the planks. I stood in the shadows, listening for the bear. I heard him coming nearer. Stones rumbled and clattered. The log rolled on the beach with a hollow sort of thump. I put my hands on the planks and peered through one of the cracks. I saw the bear right in front of me, its nose held up, sniffing along the boat. I reeked of fish. The sleeves of my shirt were covered with slime. The back was clotted with salmon blood, and I was drenched with water of a river turned gray by rotting flesh. The bear put his nose right to the boat. The only thing between us was the old planking. An inch away the bear sniffed greedily, sucking up my smell. Then he stepped away. I looked down at the bottom of the boat, strewn with gravel and sand and bits of shells. I looked up at the log and the rim of the hatch. I looked all around the fish hold for a long sliver of wood, and found one near my feet, where the log had punctured the hull and shattered 3 planks. I pulled it loose, then waited for the bear. Watching the bands of lights in the planks, I saw them darken as the bear passed in front of me. I heard it sniff and snuffle again. I heard the tiny rubbing sounds of its nose on the wood. I slipped the point of my splinter into the crack. I took a breath and then shoved it forward as hard as I could. I drove it through the planks into the snout of the grizzly bear. The piece of wood shot out of my hands, wrenched through the little slit. With a shriek, the bear fell back from the boat. I peered out and saw it rolling on the beach, thrashing its head. It bellowed in pain. When it stood up, the splinter was gone. Blood dripped from its nose, and a red stain had spread across its muzzle. It turned its head and looked straight at me. It could not possibly have seen me behind the planking, through the thin little gap where my eye was pressed to the wood. But it knew I was there. It understood what had happened. I was sure of that. Its feet wide apart, it lowered its head and smeared the blood from its face into the stones. Then it looked up again, its eyes very narrow. With another roar, it ran towards me. It smashed its head into the heavy planks. Wood cracked, the boat shook. I fell back in surprise. For a second time the bear slammed against the boat. Then its claws came through one of the cracks. Just the tips appeared, white and sharp, twitching as they groped like vampire fingers. They slid along with a rasping little sound that made my back shiver. But the bear pulled away, and the stones rattled as it walked around the boat. It found its way underneath. I heard it clawing at the gravel, trying to dig out a passage. And soon, through the hole in the floor, I saw gravel moving, falling into a pit that the bear was digging underneath me. Its claws squeaked on the rock. The floor heaved up against my feet. The bear was right below me, tunneling into the beach. I stomped my feet on the floor, and for a moment it stopped, but then it started again, and the gravel kept flowing away, the pit getting deeper. The claws appeared, raking through the gravel. A shaggy paw reached closer and closer. The boat tilted. Just a tiny bit, it rolled towards the bear. The huge log shifted on the hatch, and flakes of shell and sand came drifting down. The digging stopped. I squinted through the planks and saw the bear lying on the beach, sprawled across the stones like an enormously fat old man. I imagined it trying to figure out what to do now, how to get inside the boat. Or was it now content to lie and wait for however long it took, knowing that sooner or later I would have to come out? Shadows turned and stretched as the sun went by. The tide began to rise again, and still the bear lay on the beach. Wave after wave after wave came crashing up onto the stone, each one a little higher. Hours passed before I heard the raven calling. I looked up through the hatch as Thursday appeared, drifting sideways on the wind. His long flight feathers curled up and shifted as he kept himself level. His head tilted and sunlight glinted on his eyes. Then he drew back on his wings and dropped down to the boat, landing on the edge of the hatch. I got to my feet and reached up, stroking the soft little feathers on his belly. He spoke to me first in his raven language, and then with real words, amazingly clear. "You're finished." He puffed his wings. He tipped his head. He was just making sounds, I assured myself. He was just repeating what he'd heard from the cabin guy, but he seemed too much like a prophet, like a little seer come to tell me my future. He crouched down and scraped my arm with his beak. It was a gentle, soothing thing to do, and I tickled the hairs on his nostril. He always liked it when I did that. With a little cry, he straightened up again. Like a rooster, he raised himself on his feet, with his wings flapping, and he started to shout and raven again. He muttered and shouted as loudly as he could. A moment later the boat shook. There was a terrible crack of wood and grinding of logs. The bear was back. My raven kept screaming. The bear clawed at the planks. The darkening shadow it cast on the hull spread higher and higher, blotting out the light all the way to the top of the hull. I was sure that the raven was shouting in fright. I couldn't imagine any other reason, but I wished he would stop because his cries were only drawing the bear towards the hatch. From foot to foot the raven hopped above me. His mouth wide open, he kept shouting his strange little cries. The boat groaned and shifted again, then the raven flew away, and into its place came the bear. That huge fur-covered head loomed above me. A paw reached down. I dropped to the floor. The bear's claws slashed above me back and forth. With a grunt and a snarl, the bear changed its position and reached further into the boat. I backed into the corner. The bear swatted at me, roared, and tried again. Then it pulled up its paw and drew away from the hatch, and for a moment everything was quiet. But the silence exploded again into a fury and noise as the bear hurled itself against the log that covered the hatch. It was a huge old tree. In the forest it must have stood more than 100 feet tall. Where it rested on the boat, it was 6 feet across. But the bear moved it easily. Though only an inch or two, it moved it again another inch, throwing its whole weight against the wood. No other sounds came from Thursday. I couldn't tell if he had flown away or if he was perched somewhere nearby, silent and waiting. It was a strange image I had, that black bird atop a white log, watching as the bear tried to kill me. Until the sun went down, until the darkness came, the bear kept bashing at the log. When it stopped, I couldn't see a thing. I couldn't tell if it had shifted the log, or if it had widened the hole enough to get through, or even if it had given up and gone away. There was no sound but the wind and the waves on the beach. I lay on the bottom of the boat with no idea where the bear would attack next. Every time I dared to think it might have gone away, I heard the clinking of stones or the rumble of a log. I knew the bear was moving then, but where was it going? That was the worst thing of all, not knowing where it would appear next. Would he try to get in from above or up from below? I didn't dare stand underneath the hatch, and I didn't dare lie too close to the hole. I had just a tiny space to huddle in. There was a clinking, a rattling of stones, then no sound at all. Without moving a muscle, barely breathing, I waited. I clenched my fists as though that could somehow help me here. I was sure the bear had gone. I crawled back to the side of the boat and pressed my ear against the planks. The surf was so loud that it thrummed in the wood. I heard another noise too, a faint trickle of water that puzzled me at first. But then with a chill, I realized it was the sound of tiny crabs sculling for safety under the stones. And suddenly the bear banged against the boat, knocking me backwards, shifting the entire wreck. Above me the enormous log rumbled across the hatch. The bear clawed at the planks on the side of the boat. One of them tore loose. With a machine gun sound, old nails popped and broke as the plank peeled away from each rib. A hole 4 inches high stretched from one end of the boat to the other. Through the gap I saw the surf, a phosphorescent glow that flared with every breaking wave. There wasn't enough light for me to see the bear, but its enormous mass loomed in front of me. I saw a tiny glint against his claws as they reached inside again. Another plank sprang loose, with a creak of wooden nails. I fled up through the hatch, squirming past the log. The green glow of the surf flashed all along the beach. Over the logs I ran. I stumbled from one to another and fell into the spaces in between them, but up I got and ran again, bumbling along like a terrified scarecrow. I could hear the bear tearing at the wreck of the reepicheep, but I didn't stop running till I reached the cliffs. For a few moments I rested, leaning against the rock as I breathed huge breaths. Then I pulled myself up through the darkness, crawling on the ground. When the moon rose at last behind the tattered clouds, I got to my feet and ran the rest of the way to the cabin. Near the end of the trail, I heard Frank shouting. Something banged and clattered. Frank cried again, "Get out!" I stopped at the edge of the clearing. The cabin window flashed red and yellow from the light of a fire. Inside, Frank was screaming. The bear had got him. I was sure of that. It had come through the forest and reached the cabin before me. Run away, I told myself. You can't fight a bear. You can't help Frank. It would only mean both of us dying. I don't even like him, I thought. I wish he was dead. I had a million reasons to run away and leave him. Why they suddenly all meant nothing, I didn't understand. I grabbed a hefty stick from the little pile against the wall and charged towards the door. It was closed. I smashed right into it, shattering the latch and bending the door back on its hinges. I fell into the cabin, sprawling across the floor. Frank was standing on the bed with a torch in his hand. Its flame gouted up towards the ceiling in a curl of black smoke. Thursday was huddled high in the corner where I had never seen him before, all twisted around with his talons gripping the very top of the wall. They both stared at me, astonished. "What do you think you're doing, moron?" said Frank. Breathless from running, my heart still racing with fear, I lay on the cold ashes looking up at him. "Where's the bear? Where's the bear?" "The bear?" he asked. "You were shouting," I said. "At your raven." He swung the torch toward the bird. "Don't do that," I told him. Thursday, with a shriek, cowered back in his corner. Frank poked at him again with the torch. "Stop!" I shouted, but it was too late. Poor Thursday, thrashing his wings, dropped from the wall and escaped through the window. "That bird tried to kill me," said Frank. Nothing made much sense to either of us. I closed the door, wedging it shut, then turned to see Frank looming right in front of me, his torch nearly scorching the ceiling. "Look at me!" He lowered the torch and turned his head. There were little red scratches on his neck, a small drop of blood. "Look! The raven did that," he said. "I was asleep. It pounced on me, Chris. I met the bear," I said. "It attacked me twice. The first time it knocked me down in the river." Even Frank realized that his scratches seemed ridiculous compared to that. He sat on the bed. "What happened?" "It came running at me," I said. "I fell down and it sniffed me. It sniffed me all over, then went away and—" "Bluff charge," said Frank. "That's not unusual for a Grizz. They run at you and then stop at the last minute. They try to scare you." "It works," I said. "I went down the river and I thought it was gone, but it came after me. It followed me up the beach all the way to the Reepicheep." As I told Frank what happened, he let the torch tilt in his hands until it came dangerously close to the old wooden table. I took it from him and built a real fire in the circle of stones, wanting to fill the cabin with light and heat. Kneeling by the ashes, I saw matches scattered across the floor. Their heads were black and burnt. "Blame your raven for that," said Frank, catching me looking at the matches. "I couldn't light the torch with him peeking at me. Lucky for him there's still one left." "One left?" After the terror of the grizzly bear and my flight through the night, the loss of matches was almost too much. To me they looked like little fallen soldiers. They were the most important things in our world, the only defense against cold and hunger. I found the nearby empty cylinder under the table and closed it tightly. "I feel so sick," said Frank. "I feel just awful." He turned towards the bed, and I saw his black glove lying on top of the mattress. As though he'd forgotten he wasn't wearing it, he snatched it up and put it on. "Let me see your hand," I said. "No." Frank kept it hidden. In the firelight and shadows, I caught a glimpse of purple swollen fingers. Then he stretched out on the bed, his face towards the wall. "Don't let the raven come in," he said. "Please, Chris. Promise you'll keep it out."